Welcome back to Laravel Podcast Season 4. Today we're talking to John Bonaccorsi, lead programmer at Titan, about database migrations, factories, and seeding. Stay tuned. All right, welcome back to the Laravel Podcast Season 4, where every single episode is about a specific topic. And today we are talking about migrations, factories, and Cedars with my friend, the Factory King, John Bonaccorsi. John, other than being the Factory King and my friend, could you introduce yourself to the people?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is John Bonaccorsi. I live in New Jersey with my wife and my golden retriever. And I am a lead programmer at Titan, which just means that the host of this podcast interviewing me right now is also my boss. And I have been informed that if this episode does not perform well, I will be fired. So
there's going to be consequences.
Please don't tune out, because my job depends on it.
What's in Peter Pan, didn't they do that where like people had to do something for the fairy to live? Did they have to clap or snap or something?
I think you're more of an expert on that than me, but
oh my goodness, you call me a Peter Pan. Now I have to look up.
Having kids,
Tinkerbell.
It's been a while since I...
That's true. My kids did watch it. I watched it with my kids. Hold on. Peter Pan, Tinkerbell, Peter Pan, Tinkerbell. How do you even Google this? Bring back to life, maybe? I'm not really curious. And they like told all like the kids like who are watching, you need to do blah, 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 blah,
don't they need
blah.
to like clap or something like that?
That's what I was saying. It's like something clap. Don't like tink diet, clap. Yep. All right. So anyway, if you want John to keep his job and you're listening to this right now, whenever he says something like really smart, just kind of clap, like in your car, in your crowded office. I guess it's COVID, right? So it's not a crowded office, but like, at the bus stop or whatever, like clap, and that'll help him, keep his job.
And Matt will hear it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll hear it. Wherever I am. Even if I'm sleeping, I will wake up and I will hear the clap. My microphone is not staying up. Okay, cool. So, John, so we're talking about 3 individual topics, which is totally unfair because I'm going to ask all these questions to you 3 times.
Sure.
But for everyone who doesn't know, migrations, factories, and Cedars are database related. I didn't want to do them as the same as the database because I really think they deserve their own treatment. And there are some kind of ways that they are often used in spaces that are kind of the same. But it's really 3 different topics. So I'm going to have to ask you the 5-year-old question for all 3 of them. So let's start with migrations. If you had to explain database migrations to a 5-year-old, how would you do it?
Yeah, I'm going to try. I'm glad that I'm getting this question 3 times because it was my most dreaded question. Because I feel like,
yeah, great.
The cynical answer to me was like, I would never try to explain this.
Touché.
And I feel like the majority of people, they start answering it like it's a 22-year-old. So I'm going to do my best here to really answer this like I would answer for a 5-year-old. And, bear with me, it might be nonsense.
Do it for the claps. Do it for the claps, John.
There we go. All right, so migrations, if I had to say migrations for a 5-year-old, I would say that similar to how you have a booklet or a guide that teaches you how to build things in Legos and stuff like that.
Okay.
Migrations are just like that, where the Legos are kind of synonymous with the pieces of your database, and migrations are kind of the instruction booklet about how to build it. I think that's really the most straightforward response I could give there.
I think that was very good. I think it deserves some claps. I only have one criticism, which is the word synonymous.
So let's synonymous?
You said synonymous because it's 100% the way you normally talk. I know you. So if we were to take that and replace the word synonymous, well, the good thing is the audience of this podcast actually does know what that means. So we're good. So you did pretty good. So goal for number 2 is just don't use the word synonymous and you're good to go. All right. So the next one is how do you explain database factories to a 5-year-old?
All right, so this is the tough one, and this is the one that I honestly thought about the most. So you're really going to have to bear with me here, but I'm going to give it my best shot. So you know how when you're like a little kid and you're watching a TV commercial and there's like it's sort of like a robot toy, and the robot in the commercial, got a little kid and he's like playing with the robot, but he has like this full landscape and he's like using the robot to punch down buildings, and the buildings are made of blocks and they fall apart and it looks so cool. You're like, I need this robot. Yeah. So you order the robot and it comes to your house, but playing with it isn't quite the same as in the commercial. It's not as exciting because you don't have these these buildings to destroy. It's not the same thing. So you end up taking a bunch of like Coke bottles or Pepsi, and you stack them up, and then you have the robot punch them, and that's about as best as you can do. I would say that those Coke bottles are the most similar thing I can think of to factories in Laravel, which is that you have this world and you're building something up and it's kind of crude, but it's basically just there so that your robot can knock it down. And if we're going to complete really this metaphor, I'd say that like, you're the little kid, the robot is your app, and the building is the factories.
Okay. I like it. So our apps are destroying our data, punching it down like a robot.
I should have, you know what? I like that you caught me there, because I think the robot is really your tests. So I'd say that.
There you go. Okay, that's good.
That's what I meant to say. Yeah.
I like it. That's good. No, that was really fantastic. There was a word you used in this one I was going to tease you about, but I got so distracted by imagining our apps just destroying our databases, and it made me really happy. So
I'm just trying to distract you from my grammar. It's just
the thing is, it's good grammar.
Oh, is it?
It's fantastic grammar. That's the thing. It's like when you speak to a 5-year-old. So here's a total side note to everybody for this section. First of all, when you speak to a 5-year-old, you do need to dumb it down a little bit because they don't know the same words and they don't kind of process things the same ways. But the person who, so there's a few people in my life who treat children and pets as if they're more capable of like advanced speech than we tend to think of them as. Mm-hmm. And the pets and children around these people are always like the brightest. And I think that there is, while you do have to dumb down your talk to a 5-year-old a little bit, like in terms of the grammar and the vocabulary, I think it's a lot less than we tend to assume.
Yeah.
So you're on the train for eventually having kids and them being like super brilliant because you're like synonymous 6-month-old. What's up?
That's a fair point.
The third one. How do you explain Cedars to a 5-year-old?
This is a tougher one. I'd say that, if we're going to stick on the previous metaphor a little bit, and if you have, this world, if you're building up that landscape in your house to look like the commercial, and you have, your buildings and stuff like that, if you ever had like, if you started to do that over and over again, and you had your fake police station, which is made out of Coke bottles, and you had your hospital, which is made out of, whatever other kind of bottle or, whatever. Whatever kind of plan you have in your mind or on paper of where all those things go in your little landscape, that is your cedar. That is kind of, how things are built up in multiple different ways and kind of what you're, grouping those things together and stuff like that. That's a little rough. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know if that fully tracks. I don't know if any of this fully tracks, but
it makes sense.
That's the best I can do.
I like it. It was metaphor. That was the word I was going to tease you about. What's a metaphor, Uncle John? Okay. So I like it. The one thing, so I'm trying to imagine this metaphor. So we're creating this like little pretend world, and the buildings we're building represent our data, right?
Yes.
Okay. So a factory makes it really easy to make like a certain type of data, right? So it's sort of like a factory is like a pre-planned idea of how to make like a hospital or something like that. Or are you saying a factory is like a bottle? Is that what you...
Yeah, I'd say like a factory is like, I think that grouping of bottles, like your fake little hospital. But yeah.
And then a cedar is like a whole like plan of a whole thing, right?
Exactly.
It's like a bigger... Okay. Yeah. I love it. That I've never, regardless of 5-year-olds or buildings, I've never thought about the fact that in many ways Cedars are just bigger factories. And I love that idea. I don't know if you did that on purpose, but it's a really cool way of coming at it with your brain. So
I think we'll talk more about Cedars, but I think that is, I think I always think of them as groupings of factories. So
that's awesome.
Same thing,
it totally makes sense. I just never had thought of them as just like a bigger section of the same thing. Okay, cool. Yeah. So now let's talk. I don't want to walk right into common use cases because you did such a good job of keeping it to a 5-year-old that I do want somebody. Now let's talk about somebody who has been writing PHP for 20 years, but just doesn't understand how these topics are going to be used. Can you tell me a little bit about how you would use migrations, factories, and Cedars each in the same places or different places? Like what are each of them used for in your day-to-day Laravel app?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that migrations, if you think about it, if you're new to Laravel, and you're probably not new in general to web apps or databases and stuff like that. So, anytime that you are building an app and it has a database, you're going to have, those databases are going to have tables and columns and all kinds of stuff like that. And basically what migrations allow you to do is basically create a schematic for those tables and those columns so that no matter where you are, no matter if you're on a different computer, if you're on a different server, if you're on production, if you're on staging, if you're, wherever you are, that you can always build up the exact same database with the exact same structure based off of those migrations. So you're not having to remember or write down, add this column here and make it null or give it a default value of this or that. It's all right there in code for you, and it kind of keeps track of that. So that's typically when I'm using migrations. I think one of the interesting things about migrations is that it kind of has a secondary use, which is managing content that is the same across all databases or all basically all instances of your database. And that is probably one of the things I remember being most tripped up as like a new Laravel programmer is like, I remember hearing about migrations and then hearing about Cedars and being like, when it came to like adding data into the production database that needed to be there in every environment. Like for instance, that might be like a list of states or a list of countries, or if you're writing a blog, a list of blog topics that needs to be there in every environment. They're always the same, all that kind of stuff. I remember Googling like 6 years ago, like, how do I do a production Cedar? Like what, because that was the only way to think about adding content to me was like, what is a production Cedar? And, the answer was, and I think really this didn't get solidified to me really until I came to Titan, which is like, no, your migrations are not only for managing your database structure, but for any kind of content that is, intrinsically connected to the database. So that might be things that are, lists of states that are in every environment or countries or whatever that may be. And I think that's a little bit, I don't know, I think it's not really natural for a lot of people to think about it like that. A lot of people get tied in to think about, no, migrations are just for, schema. And
schema,
and do I write a command, add this data or whatever it may be? But no, migrations are really the perfect place to manage data that is consistent across environments. And, after doing it for a while, it feels good to me. I'm not saying that there couldn't be a better solution for it. Sometimes it still does feel a little icky. But for the most part, it's a pretty elegant solution. And that's the second kind of major use case I'd say there are for migrations.
Before you jump to the next one, I love that idea because one of the things that helps you ask the question of is a migration or a Cedar or something else good for this is, does the app function without this data?
Right.
And if the answer is yes, then it's probably Cedar data because in the production application, it will probably be replaced by real user data. But if the answer is no, I get to a page where there's a drop down that should show me a list of all of our corporate locations or whatever else. And that page literally doesn't work without this data. Like that may be an indication. Now, that's not always true. Like there's some things where like you have to have at least one user, but that doesn't mean the user's migrated data, right? But a lot of times where it's like underlying structures of the application rely on this data, and this data is going to be the same across all installs, and we might modify it like once in a while, but probably not. Those are all really good signs that like that data is more kind of architectural, right? Like if you could even consider storing that data just in a hard-coded array somewhere, that might be a good spot for migrations. Is that a good way to think about it for you? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I'd say the same thing. Yep.
All right, cool. So I interrupted you. So the next step was factories and Cedars, kind of what they are for an actual programmer who's been programming, not a 5-year-old.
Yeah, so I think the best way to talk about factories is that, once you have your table set up, anytime, once your app in general is set up, and that includes your migrations in your database and your table, and when you're testing that app, and when I say testing, I don't just mean automated testing, but I mean even just testing that a lot of people do, which is just manual testing, clicking around the app and stuff like that. You're going to find yourself in situations where you need data that would typically be created by users. So for instance, if you're, writing a blog app and you post in the database so that you can make sure, that the blog has the right content or something like that. You put yourself in a situation where you go, oh, okay, well, how do I get this data into the database? And you could manually create it, right? Like you could just go to the app itself and write your blog and add the content and it would be there and stuff like that. But then you realize maybe I need a blog post that's archived or one that's unpublished or one that's written by somebody else. And before you know it, if you're manually creating all these different types of entities or this data, it's just, you're in for kind of a world of pain there. Like you're just, it's hard. And if you're on a different environment, all of a sudden maybe do that locally and then you're on staging and you don't have all that data. And you go, oh no, this is really bad. So basically what factories are a way to get fake data into your database. And they kind of sync in terms of Laravel, they sync up basically directly with your Laravel models and they kind of connect one-to-one there. And they give you a way to basically on the fly generate fake data for the database. And they work hand in hand with this other PHP package called Faker, which allows you to fill out the columns in the database. So let's say you have a blog and your blog has a title and has content. And obviously when you fill those things out, you need a title and you need content and maybe you need topics or something like that. And factories work with Faker to generate that data on the fly. So it'll give you a fake title, it'll give you fake content, it can give you random numbers, it can give you booleans, whatever that may be. And so that's basically it. And they also have this concept, they have a lot of different concepts, but factories also have this concept of state. So that if you have a column in your database that is like, is published or is, which is true or false in your database, depending on, if this is a blog app, you could, instead of having to, set that is published column to true or false every single time you use this factory, you could create an unpublished state. And once you use that state, it would automatically set that column to true or false, depending on what the state was. And that's kind of the idea there. It's just basically the high level there. Just get fake data into your database so that you don't have to do it all yourself manually. And then in terms of Cedars, because I think Cedars work kind of hand in hand, obviously, with factories. We talked about this earlier about how Cedars are essentially groups of factories. And I think that is the way that I typically use them, which is just a way to group factories together. Because, if you're writing an app and you have kind of like a flow going and okay, I have a blog and it needs comments and it needs topics and it needs this or that. That's not one factory, right? That's like three at least. You have your topics. You need your connection between the topics and the blog. You need your comments and all that kind of stuff. You need users who fill out those comments. All of a sudden, you're using like 10 factories out of nowhere. And so Cedars are basically ways to group similar stories. So if you have like, okay, I need, maybe you'll have like an unpublished blog Cedar or something like that. And that creates like an unpublished blog that you wrote, an unpublished blog that someone else wrote, an unpublished blog from 3 years ago, and whatever it may be. It's just kind of going through and grouping your factories together. And I think all of these Cedars in particular are kind of, they're general enough that a lot of people use them in a lot of different ways, but that's typically the way that I use them. It's just think of them as a grouping for factories.
I love it. And it's so funny because even for me to say like that even seems remotely transformational is like, well, duh, Matt, of course that's what they are. But it's interesting because sometimes with factories and Cedars and migrations, the concept is simple, but really knowing when to use it and how and where and which things it solves other than like the core can sometimes take your brain a little bit to wrap around, which is one of the reasons I have you on. And just I didn't mention this, but for anybody who doesn't know, so John has been, he wrote a podcast he wrote an article on the Titan blog that I'll link in the show notes about factories. And he also was on the 20% Time podcast, which is the Titan podcast a month ago or something like that.
Yeah, about.
And talking about this idea of how to use, factories and in an organized way that makes a ton of sense and addresses a really common problem, but in a way that just thinks a little bit freshly about factories. And we maybe will go into that to the end. If we had gotten to the point where we really feel like we've kind of like covered everything else, we might kind of go into that. I don't want to go into it yet because I don't know if it'll make sense yet.
Sure.
But definitely go check those both out. But one of the reasons I brought John on this podcast is because I think that he has been thinking about alternate ways for us to encounter and approach these three things, migrations, factories, and Cedars, in a way that I think a lot of us will benefit from, but not a lot of us have actually taken the time to do. So anyway, if anybody feels like these things are really simple, on the first hand, good. I'm really glad you feel like you got it. On the other hand, these are one of those things where sometimes you're going to go, wait a minute, how should I have done that? Or what should I have used? Or you'll encounter a problem and not realize that these are tools you should use for that problem. So I think that's why it's really great to have John, because he explains and understands these things in a way that gives us more maybe permission and ideas for how to use them in different contexts. So anyway, that's one of many reasons I have John here. One of the other ones is his epic beard and his luscious hair that you all unfortunately miss out on. But it's just trust me, it's there.
Just visualize it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So normally at this point in the conversation, I ask, when's the last time you used the system? But of course, you use all of them. But I would say let's go really quickly and go through what you just said. Mm-hmm. But I want to take it from just to kind of give me bullet points. So when you're working with migrations, first of all, what's the most common use case for a migration?
Yeah, I mean, the most common use case for a migration is that you have a new table in your database and you need to build it out. And that's just,
Yep. And then the second most common is modifying or deleting tables.
Modifying,
right?
Yeah, modifying tables or adding data or something like that. That's kind of further down the list. But 90% of the time when you're making a migration, it's because you have a new model that you want to build or a new entity and you just need a table for it. Yeah. Yep,
totally. With factories, what's the most common time you use factories?
Yeah, so this might be different across people, but for me, the most common time I'm using factories is when I am writing an automated test in something like PHP Unit or whatever framework you may be using, and you need there to be data in the database for that test to kind of build its world. And that's the most common time. I'd also say there's a very, to have a second bullet point here, I'd say the other most common thing is like if you are on a server and you just directly need some data in your database right now. Maybe it's just like, you fire up PHP Artisan Tinker, you go in there, you make 10 factories or whatever it may be, and you get your data right away without any kind of clicking around the UI. And that's probably, depending on if you're a developer who is more experienced in writing tests or something like that, you're probably going to be more towards the first one. But if you're a developer who's not quite there yet, you're probably going to be using the second one.
Yeah. And the third would probably just be in your Cedars. right?
In your
like
Cedars.
And for anyone who's not familiar, so Tinker is the command line tool, because I don't think we've done our command line one yet. It's a command line tool that allows you, it's sort of, if you've ever done Ruby, it's sort of like a REPL. If you haven't, don't worry about it. Actually, it is a REPL. It's sort of like whatever Ruby's REPL is called, which I can't remember now. But anyway, you're going into there, and when you type a command, it's a read, evaluate, print loop. So when you type a command and hit enter, Tinker evaluates it against your artisan or against your Laravel application. So if you were to write something like, user : all, which would, we learned last week or in the database episode would give me all the users in the entire user table. It would go run that command as if something was doing it, and then it would return it back to you. So it's print, and then it would give you the next line that you can work with it. And so one of the things that John mentioned is something I do on almost every single application when I spin it up, which is rather than seeding users for yourself, because then you end up with Cedars that kind of just have to have like your name and your username and your password for every time you spin up a new version of your app. So instead, when I spin up a new app, the first thing I do is I go PHP artisan Tinker, and then I say basically what you're saying is user equals, and then you're making like a factory of the user, and then you would just set the properties to be your own. Or especially if you need things there that you don't need to set anything, like let's say like he had mentioned, maybe you want 10 blog posts in your thing, you would just say, basically use the factory to create a whole 10 blog posts, hit enter, and then it'll just be in the database there. So yeah. And I wouldn't have even thought of that. I'd use that all the time, and I wouldn't have put it at the top of my mind. But you're absolutely right. That's a super common case for that. So when are Cedars most commonly used?
I'd say Cedars are most commonly used in, for me, I guess I should just answer for myself. For me, Cedars are most commonly used to set up data, groups of fake data for an actual like staging site. That typically just tends to be the time I most use it. So, I mean, for instance, we have a product called Field Goal at Titan, and you can be a Field Goal user with a free trial, or there's 4 different types of subscriptions, and basically it's just your typical SaaS service, and you have all these subscriptions, and for that site, whenever I'm working on it and I'm making changes to it, I want to test like 10 different types of accounts, like a user who's in their free trial, but the free trial's expired, a user who's still in their free trial period, a user who has a subscription but canceled it, and blah, 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 blah. Yeah. And doing that over and over again, it was rough. And so what I did was on Field Goal, I have a Cedar that creates a bunch of fake users with all those different things. Free trial, expired, no subscription, but it's this plan, blah, 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 blah. And they all have these very specific emails. It'll be like, user with free trial at test.com or something like that.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And basically whenever I need to test staging, or whatever I'm testing locally, I'll just run that Cedar, and then I immediately have 10 accounts with every different type of user at my disposal. And the great thing about that is if, the staging site gets blown up, which, sometimes that happens, right? Like someone runs a command, the database gets wiped, who knows what happens. It's not your concern, because you just rerun that Cedar, and all of a sudden you have all the data that you ever needed, and you're good to go.
Yep. And you can also run that same Cedar on your local machine. And then if your local machine dies, you don't worry about losing the contents of your database, right? Because you just clone it to the new machine and then run your Cedar, and then boom, it's fully populated as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there's a second way that people use Cedars a lot. And there's been a little drama in the Laravel community, in the last couple of months, which we can maybe get into later, but if we have time.
Yeah,
but
I
mean, a lot of people also, I think whenever you're looking at like these things, there's always going to be a duality of people who are using it kind of like on the fly to get data into an actual app so they can hand test the app. And then there's going to be the second subset of people who are primarily using it to write automated tests. And, same thing with factories, right? You can run it in Tinker, you can run it in a test route or something like that, or you can write it in your test. And with Cedars, it's the same thing. You might be running a Cedar on your staging site, and that could be fine, just like I just described. Or a lot of times people are using them to group factories in their tests, in their automated tests. So that's kind of the second. And, those things they're not mutually exclusive. You could create a Cedar for your test and then also use it on your actual site if you wanted to. But I'd say if we're talking about the 2 most common use cases of Cedars, to me, it's easily those 2.
All right. And so one of the reasons, and I put a note for us to talk about drama later, but I do want to note that one of the things, because remember I said that you all are, it's not quite time for us to talk about John's particular approach in his blog post and stuff like that. But there is a note, which is that John's idea that he introduced most publicly, and this is not the only unique thought he's had, but the one that's most publicly is something around organizing your factories, and is organizing your factories using PHP classes rather than organizing your factories using Cedars. And obviously from the this podcast, you can hear that he does both in different contexts. And that's, where some of the drama is. But I did also notice here, which is something I didn't actually know, which is that there's also a Laracast's video where he says, to do this, we'll use a technique that I first learned from John Bonaccorsi, blah, blah, blah. So I will make sure I link that one in the show notes as well, because we got to, get the Laracast John Bonaccorsi love as well.
Can I tell you this real quick?
Yeah.
Jeffrey Way, not that I know him at all or am in any kind of, interpersonal relationship with him, but he didn't even tell me that he did that video. Someone tweeted
he just kind of snuck it out.
I'm a big fan of Laracast. I've watched it for 10 years, whatever, how long it's been around, I've been a fan.
Yeah.
And someone tweeted me once and was like, I watched your Laracast video. And I was like, what?
My what?
I was like,
you're mixing me up with the other guy with the rich hair and the handsome beard.
Yeah, so I was so Jeffrey, next time hit me up if you.
It's funny. For anyone who doesn't know, Jeffrey is a wonderful human. He's also an extraordinary introvert, like one of the most introverted people I've met in my entire life. So that's not actually that abnormal.
I'm honored that he did it. I'm fine.
Yeah,
with it.
Totally. It's super cool. Yeah, and I'll link it out to all y'all. So okay, cool. So let's get back to where we were, because I will jump around a million times. Okay, so did I have you talk about Cedars too? Yes? Where you normally... Okay, cool. Yeah, so that's where we were. All right, so the next section of this podcast is usually, what are some times the system has tripped you up, or what are common challenges, or what do you wish everyone knew about the system? Now, you can say all of those, but I definitely want to make sure we end on the what do you wish everyone else knew about the system. So let's start with, are there any common gotchas or any common challenges or any places where any of these three systems like kind of trip people up because they're not thinking about it right, or they don't understand something or anything like that?
Yeah, totally. I think anything can trip somebody up, and I've definitely been tripped up by all three of them, right? And we've kind of touched on some of those trip ups already, just indirectly. Yeah. But one of them, not to go too far in it because we've already talked about it, but using migrations as content managers, right? That is a big thing that trips people up. They try to avoid it. They think it's wrong, whatever it may be. So that's probably one thing with migrations. Another thing with migrations, I think, is that people at first maybe don't realize that they're immutable. So, and that's kind of, if anyone isn't familiar with what that means, it just basically means that once a migration has run, particularly on your production environment, it cannot be changed. And there's a caveat there. There's like a 0.0001% time where that you get a little weird and you do change it. But I'd say this, like, you really should never be changing migrations that have already been run. And that's because, if anyone's unfamiliar with the migration system in general, basically the way that it works is that, your migrations are just files. They're just PHP classes and, so they're special classes, but they're basically just these classes. And when they run against an environment, whether that's staging or your local or production or whatever it may be, when they run, Laravel stores that migration has been run in your database in a migrations table. And so the problem, the reason we say migrations are immutable is because once they run that one time, they never run again when you run PHP Artisan migrate. And so, sometimes when we've been talking with clients or people who are new to Laravel and they never had been familiar with this, they'll be like, how do I, I changed the column in a migration that ran 3 months ago and it didn't pop up. And it's like, well, no, if you, if you create a table, like a users table or a blogs table or whatever it may be, and then 3 months down the line, you need to add a new, is published column to it. You're not editing that existing migration. You're creating a new migration that says something like, create or add is published column to users or blogs table or whatever it may be.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And that's definitely a trip up for migrations. I think that there's also like dealing with like foreign keys sometimes, or indexes in migrations can sometimes be tricky just based off the name. I know with like indexes in particular, you can like pass it in two ways and they both mean slightly different. Like if it's an array, it means one thing. And if it's not an array, it means a different thing. And I still get tripped up by those things sometimes, to be quite honest with you. So, there's little moments like that. But to me, those things, they get, working with databases in general can be hard. Figuring out what is the right type of content. What is, when do I need an index? What kind of index do I need? Do I need a foreign key here? Those aren't necessarily particular to migrations themselves. That's more just like database
architecture
that everyone has. So
I
don't know if I'd pin that on migrations, but that's where they'll most likely bubble up for you, because that's where you're working with those things.
Yeah. And it can often be easy to not notice that. So there was a thing I did for I think we discovered it was a year or two, where I chained the creation of an index after the creation of the column. So I just did it fluently, table, arrow, whatever. And then right after that, I did the arrow for the column, and it didn't error out. And I thought I'd seen it somewhere. And it turns out I was silently not creating those indexes that whole time. Yeah. So one of the gotchas on migrations is that if you run them without ever actually going over to look at your database app, then you might not notice that things aren't working the way you want. So I definitely would just tell people, like, while it's magical that we can create and define our schema in code, it's still worth going over your database app at some point, just making sure that you have what you think you're going to have. And the cool thing about factories, or about factories and Cedars, but especially migrations, is that your database is not like a special, pony that you have to like take care of. It goes back to whatever the previous podcast was, where we were talking about like cattle versus pets. Like your database, other than your production database, which should be special and wonderful and everything like that, but all your other databases, you should be able to just destroy them and spin them back up very quickly, right? And so like, even to the point where if you want to like open up that database app and mess a whole bunch of stuff up, or you're not sure if it's in the right state, like get comfortable with destroying the entire database and migrating it from scratch all the time. And the more confident you are that you can do it one time, the more flexible you are to kind of like spin up new servers or whatever in the future. So
yeah, absolutely.
All right. Do you ever modify old migrations? Like ever at all?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. Can you give me a couple examples of when you might do that?
Yeah. So a couple things I'd say, and this is, so I'll go with the easiest one first, which is that sometimes I'm just a little neurotic and I don't want to add a new migration for a column. And I never do this on a client site. I'll say this. This is like when I'm Wild West, Cowboy John out in his local
working
projects.
on your own thing.
Yeah, whatever it may be. Sometimes I want my migrations to be like perfectly in sync or in line with my models. Like if I have 10 models, I want there to be 10 migrations. And so I did this recently with my side project, which is where I went back and I made all the migrations as if they were perfect, and I knew exactly what everything was when I first did it. And then I went to my migrations table and I deleted the old ones, and then I did a bunch of hocus pocus. And
that's hilarious.
And that's how necessary you feel that is up to you. I like it. I would never do it on a client project where it's like a potential danger. I might do it on like an internal project if I was like had approval and they were like, yeah, let's do it. But I did that on a personal project once where is the same thing as like everything was perfect except one thing. And there wasn't any like super important data, and it was all backed up. And I just went into SQL Pro or Tables Plus or whatever, and I just modified the column. And then I changed that same modification in the original migration, and I felt a little bit dirty and a little bit magical at the same time. There's something about it. It's like the call of the void, you just want to do it.
Yeah. And like you said, would never do it on a client project, but just sometimes you do that. So
yeah. If I'm responsible, then I'll take the risk.
Exactly. I'll take the risk. Yeah. So have you ever, and would you ever recommend in any context deleting all the old migrations and then replacing them with like one single migration that creates the database at a certain given state? Let's say that the app's been running for a long time or something. Are there any contexts in which you would recommend that?
Yes. I mean, I'm actually doing that right now for a project, which basically is that, this project was, it's been around for a long time. And they used migrations originally for a little bit. And then basically what happened is that they stopped, or somebody stopped. And all of a sudden you had some people using migrations, and you had some people going into the database and adding columns and adding indexes and stuff like that. And so...
Which you should not do, by the way, everybody. Not to shame anybody on that project, but just in general, do all your database modifications to schema in migrations, period.
Yeah, and the point of building up this kind of schematic is that you can reuse it. And if someone's hand making changes and then they forget to do it the same way, it just becomes a dangerous situation. So that is a situation where, there's two ways you can approach that. You can try to fix the existing migrations, or, there's even some tools out there that generate migrations based off of your database. And those tools are phenomenal, and I wouldn't even begin to know how to write one myself, but I've just never had success with them. There's always they're never perfect. There's always some weird collation issue with MySQL, or there's some index that didn't get properly named. I've always had a problem. And so basically the reason that you would do what Matt just described, which is delete all of your old migrations and make one migration that just imports a SQL dump, essentially, is that if your production database is so woefully out of sync with what the schematic of the migrations say they are, that's when you would just go back and delete them. And that also, involves going into your database and deleting those migration columns in your database. So that's, that's another thing that, you are editing data, and the data in production, that gets messy too. It's an unideal situation. There's no elegant way to fix it, but that is the time when I would just kind of go, scorched earth and delete everything. Yeah.
And we at Titan have done this 3 or 4 or 5 at times, at least, probably more, that I don't know about, where we were able to make it work using that tool. there's one main tool, I forget what it's called, but I'll link it in the show notes, that generates migrations from your database. But every time it's been a tiny bit imperfect. So if you do use a tool like that, you really have to sit side by side with your newly migrated thing that came out of that tool, and then with the actual production database, and ensure that you catch everything. And you'll probably have to tweak that migration file at least a little bit. And sometimes, like John said, it just doesn't work. That is certainly more ideal, where you have a single primary migration that represents everything up till then versus a SQL file. But sometimes you end up having a SQL file. But I would note that when he says a SQL dump, he does not mean a data dump. He means a SQL schema dump.
Schema dump. Yeah.
So if you do end up having to do that, you go into something like Tables Plus or SQL Pro, you hit export SQL dump, and then uncheck with data. So all it'll do is write a single .sql file that describes the entire creation of your SQL database. And then your first migration, instead of migrating everything, will actually just open up that file and run it on your database. And that's migration 1. And then, migration 2 is your, whatever the next migration you create. And sometimes you got to do it. And again, just like John said, there are things that we do at times because they're the only things that can be done. That doesn't mean we would recommend doing them unless you have to. And this is on that list for sure. Yeah.
And I think, and one thing to note is just that, and I could be wrong about this, but I'm 90% sure that Laravel 8 is going to ship with a way to do that directly. I think Taylor built in a way that you can do some kind of command and it will take an export of your database schema and create a migration for it. So I could be making this up, but I'm 90% sure that is an actual thing that's happening.
If I had known that was potentially coming, I would have pushed this episode out, a little while, but oh well. But if it does come out, I'm going to do my very best to remember to come back and add it to the show notes here. Yeah. So if you come back and then Laravel 8 is released and you don't see it in the show notes, hit me up on Twitter @StoutForMatt and I'll add it. But B, if Laravel 8 is out, you should be able to go there and hopefully see it in the show notes as well. So awesome. Are there any other gotchas or common challenges people run into, or is there one or two or three things that you really wish that everybody knew to do or not to do when working with these things?
No, I think there are some other challenges and things that you... reasons that you might even edit an old migration. And one thing I just want to mention, it might be hard to talk through, so I'll try to make it as simple as I possibly can, but I do want to note it because, as we're talking a lot about people managing content in their migrations, this could potentially bite some people pretty badly. It bit me for the first time. It totally caught me off guard very, very recently. And that is that, and again, I'll try to do this as simple as possible, but basically what had happened was I had a migration, let's just say we have a users table. So we have a migration that creates a users table, and then we have a second migration that says add something to that users table, like an admin user that's always got to be there, right? Yeah. So in that migration, I did something like user create, and I put in an admin email, and I put in whatever it may be, and then that was good to go. Right. And that was perfectly fine. Then what happened was many months later, and many migrations later, I had another I basically needed to make users soft delete. And if anyone is unfamiliar with soft deletion in Laravel, which you may be, it's basically that, typically if you delete something from the database, it's gone. It's gone from the database. And what soft deletes essentially allow you to do is they add a deleted at column to whatever database it is. So in this case, if you're at a users table, you would have a deleted at column, which is a timestamp on the users table. And when you delete, quote unquote, delete the user via Eloquent with user delete or whatever, it wouldn't actually go away from the database. It would just set that timestamp to false. And so, or it would give it a timestamp and it would say, okay, this thing is now deleted. So basically I added a migration to add the soft delete column to the users table and also add the trait, which you need on the model for the users table, and good to go. And everything, worked just fine. Then later, when I went to rerun all those migrations again, for some reason, either setting up a staging site or doing something locally, when I run to rerun them, that original migration I had made that created the admin user failed. And the reason why it failed was because the user model, which is the class I was referencing, in that first migration, now had the soft deletes trait on it. Yep. And so because of that, it's expecting also to have this deleted at column, which at the time of that first migration did not exist. Yep. So now Laravel is trying to load up the user model and saying, oh, the user also has the soft deletes. It also has this column, but actually it didn't yet at this point in time in the migration timeline. And so did you just change the time of the migration so it ran after the soft deletes migration? And that'd be one way to do it. Basically, what I really did was that I went in and I used DB table users instead to create the... I went back and edited that original migration that created the admin user.
Perfect.
And I changed it. So instead of using the models to user create, I did DB table users create, which is like a more kind of raw way of doing queries in Eloquent.
You use the query builder instead of Eloquent. So which
and
the query builder is just basically straight SQL queries that you're building with a kind of convenient syntax, right? So it doesn't know about soft deletes or anything.
Exactly. The differentiator there too is that Laravel's not loading the model. So it's interacting directly with the user's table in that case. And so didn't matter if it had soft deletes straight or not. And so that was one moment again where I had to go back and edit an existing migration. And I just thought like, oh man, this will totally impact the way that I write migrations moving forward, because that is a very real scenario that could happen. But no, other than that kind of stuff, I don't think there's anything really that I wished that people knew. There's this whole like migration conversation about, do you have a down method or do you not have a down method? And and for anyone listening, that just means like, migrations have like an up function which builds up the database, and theoretically have a down that deletes the table that you're migrating or whatever it may be. And some people are
give me some fire, John. What do you write down method? Do you write them or no? Do you write a down method or no?
I do write them,
okay.
Mostly just for consistency's sake. But I don't. But to be honest, I probably don't need to. Just because I do it because I've always done it, basically. But in reality, most people, when they're dealing with migrations, if they need to rerun them or something, they just delete the entire. Right. They
database.
do a migrate fresh.
I was going to say, when is the last time that you ran artisan migrate rollback? Because that's the only time it's going to be used, right? Is rollback. Yeah,
that's the only time when it would really be used would be the rollback method. And I feel like the only times I've had to do it is when I'm in unideal situations with like data from someone else's database that I'm working with locally, and I don't want to go too far back, or I don't want to have to re-import the database. It's mostly when like I'm in a situation that's a little sticky. But in an ideal world where you have Cedars and you have everything perfect, then you have no need for it in reality. Yeah.
And one of the reasons that people most commonly pitch the idea of a down method is, let's say you did a deploy to production on some massive website and it breaks everything. So a lot of people say what you do is you'd roll your code back one commit, using Git or Envoy or whatever, and then you'd also then run PHP artisan migrate rollback. So you'd roll your database back one commit. So in theory that works, although a lot of people that have talked about that circumstance since have said, what I'd rather do in that circumstance is write a new migration that, brings it back to the original state. I don't know if I like that idea, only because if you're rolling your code back and then you're adding a new migration forward, you're going to get into some very complicated code statuses, because that new migration, so like if you migrated your database in that code to a state that wouldn't work with the rolled back code, you got to roll back your database too. And I do think that is the most compelling reason, that if that's a workflow that you'd consider, it's the most compelling reason to consider writing those down methods. That said, I can't tell you the last time I actually used it. Like if that type of stuff happens, I have found that rollbacks almost always break something else, like rollbacks in the code and stuff like that. And I tend to instead take the whole site down, do a fix locally, and then push the fix up, in which case you don't need to roll back the database because you're just fixing whatever that minor bug is. But there's some environments where that's not possible. The bigger, the more enterprise, the more process there is, the more likely it is you're going to want a down method. The more you're a single person working on a project, or smaller teams or more agile teams or whatever else, the more likely you're going to be at least open to not using the down method. Whether or not you do is up to you. So.
Yeah, and I also think that sometimes people forget to test their down methods locally.
Yes, that's true.
And then you run them when you need them all of a sudden, and all of a sudden it goes like, actually, your foreign
there's a
key
syntax
exists,
error.
and you go, oh my god, what was the point of even?
That's true.
So it's just I've done that myself. I've forgotten to test my down migration. So and also I'm just afraid sometimes to run PHP artisan migrate rollback, because I sometimes can't remember which one does which. I'm like, what? There's refresh, there's whatever rollback, then there's the other one fresh, and I'm like,
fresh,
what? Which one does which? And then I get scared and I just do a new migration or something.
So every single time I'm working on my local database and I need to throw it away and start from scratch, I've got a certain command that I run. Before I tell it, I want to know, what is your command that you run when you need to just kind of like wipe your database, start from scratch?
Yeah, it's I have an alias. It's like PHP artisan MF or something like that, which is migrate fresh, I believe. Yeah. Okay. And then, I think it's even maybe PHP artisan MFS, which is like migrate fresh and then seed. Yeah. So I think that's the one I'll typically do. Yeah.
I actually have, I didn't, so you did a artisan alias to do that?
Yeah, I guess
or is
it's
yours
like
just MFS?
I think it's just it's like it's probably I think it's just like MFS, which is like then does in the background all of those shortcut. Commands.
Yep.
Yeah.
I have the same thing. But it's the cool thing is, even if you don't do the bash shortcut that we're talking about, you can type PHP space artisan space migrate fresh space. Is it dash seed or seed? Forget which. I'll put it in the show notes too.
Yeah, I think it's dash seed.
Once you get those shortcuts, you don't remember. But that command all in one. It doesn't work because the old one, which was I think migrate refresh, would try to run all your down methods. And then if any of your down methods are broken, you don't actually have an easy way to do this. So what you do is instead you just run migrate fresh, and that just says delete all the tables in this database and then migrate them fresh. And then if you do dash seed or whichever it is, I think it's dash seed, then you also get the fresh seeded version of all your Cedars. And that's one of the most useful things about having good migrations and good Cedars is anytime my data gets in a bad shape or I want a fresh install or whatever, I just do MFS or, what expands to PHP artisan migrate fresh seed. And then all of a sudden I've got a perfectly functional, probably 10 seconds later, 5 seconds later, I've got a brand new fresh install to work with. And it's pretty freaking fantastic. So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
all right.
Great.
So let's talk about some of the miscellany that I took notes about earlier. So the first one was, when do you know that it's time to move from keeping a particular consistent set of data in the code to by consistent set of data, I meant that stuff we were talking about earlier, where we're talking about data that you need it for the app to run. It's not user data. Maybe it's a list of all your tags or a list of all your labels or whatever else it ends up being. When do you know that it's time to move that data from code, just being an array in a class somewhere, to the database?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think I probably tend to be more aggressive than most people in putting things in the database when they could maybe go in a config file. But I'd say that anytime it gets relational, so, if you have like a list of states in a config file, it's, you're going to have, 50 of those, and then that's fine. But all of a sudden, if you need to store, which states that the user lives in or something like that, or has been to or something like that, all of a sudden now having those states in a configuration file, you can't link the user to the state because the state has no ID, it has no concept. And of course, there are ways you could do that, right? You could store like the name of the state completely instead of an ID or something like that. But when you get to the point where you need to maybe query against this data, that's my first kind of like, this should probably be stored directly in the database. Yeah.
Same here. And if this is a little bit of 201 kind of advanced stuff, but Caleb Porzio released a tool called Sushi. And what Sushi does is it allows you to have an eloquent record or an eloquent model that's backed not by a database entry, but it's instead. So in theory, it's backed by just some like an array you have in your PHP. In reality, you write out that array and then Sushi actually creates a little mini SQLite database, which is basically like a really super performant database in a file on your device. And then it saves it in there. And so the benefit of Sushi is that you both can store the data that you're migrating in code, but you can also get relationships ish. I don't know if there's any constraints in the relationships because you're storing that data not in the same database. But I think it does some work to basically if you say I've got Sushi ID number 5 and that's Oregon, and you say, Oregon arrow cities, I think Sushi takes the responsibility of figuring out what ID Oregon is, and then, looking for all the cities with that. So it's still not the same because, for example, you can't do a foreign key, a correctly constrained MySQL foreign key to a SQLite database, right? Yeah. So even if it does work the way I'm thinking right now, it's still limited. So John's solution right now is absolutely the best. I think the one downside is it's the most robust, but it's also maybe the most work. So I might start with keeping something in array or a config file. I might move into Sushi, and then I might move from there into actually using a Cedar like you're talking about that. Yeah. But I do one of the downsides. I feel like I've run into a circumstance where when the list of data that I wanted to seed that way changed, let's say they said there's only 5 tags ever. We don't want users to be able to add their tags. And later they're like, actually, there's only 6 tags ever. And one of the tags is earlier in the list. Yeah. Then all of a sudden your relationships could all break. And so you have to decide, how am I going to handle adding that 6th tag in such a way that it doesn't break the fact that all these things are related to tag number 2. So I can't change which tag is tag number 2.
Right.
But even in that circumstance, the answer for me at least has been, and I'm curious your experience has been, well, add tag number 6 and don't sort them by ID. Sort them alphabetically or something like that. So it doesn't matter what order they're in. Is that kind of your thinking as well?
Yeah, totally. Nothing should ever be, in my mind, that dependent on the ID
Agreed.
being a certain ID. But yeah, absolutely. I'd say sorting them by the name alphabetically, or we've been in situations where they need a particular order and you create an order column, which is an integer, and you order by that. And that's not a big deal at all.
Totally. And if you're a little daunted by the idea of having to maintain like an order column, because what happens if I need to reorder them and then now do I have to change all of them? Well, it is possible, but usually if you do have to change that type of thing, it's going to happen once on a small set and you just got to deal with it. If it's happening once in a complicated set, you could write a one-off PHP script that modifies all of them and bumps all the ones over integer, ID 2. It bumps them all up by 1. Or not ID 2, but sort 2. But if you're actually dealing with it in the front end, there's a ton of JavaScript and PHP libraries that make it super easy to just say, move sort item number 4 right below sort item number 2. And these libraries, whether it's a jQuery library, a Vue library, or a PHP library, take the responsibility of incrementing that sort number because this is just such a common problem. Yeah. So I do think that like the number one criticism of the idea of putting core data in via a Cedar is solved by not sorting by ID.
Right. Yeah.
Yep. I love it. And for anybody for whom that was really hairy, sorry, but we're trying to get into a little bit of this miscellaneous. So, okay. So the next one is, you said in the last couple of months, there's been some drama in the Laravel community around Cedars and stuff. What's the drama? Is it a good time to talk about it or no?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, it's not that big of a deal, but okay. I remember basically what this, and this kind of goes back to my post about model factories and how you can kind of improve them and stuff like that. But, there was a point where a lot of people, I think, online were pushing for something like that. And the response from some people higher up in Laravel, including Taylor at the time, I remember he made a tweet about it, was like, I never really use, factories. Like he almost was saying, like, I don't feel the need for factories to be improved.
I missed all this.
Oh, you didn't see that?
No. Or was it the one where you that issue sat open forever?
No, that was
that was. I saw
different.
that one. Yeah, I didn't see this at all.
Yeah, wow. So Taylor at some point had been like, and he wasn't having a conversation with me, but he had kind of tweeted like, does anyone use I feel like you don't really need better factories because, I use this group things with Cedars and then I have my tests run Cedars and stuff like that. Oh, I
feel like I must have been out of commission at this point. Like it's vaguely familiar. And I use factories every day. Yeah,
and I mean, the argument, of course, is not like that you don't use factories because obviously even your Cedars typically do use factories. So even if you're not, and that was kind of
you don't need them to be better. Yeah.
Yeah, his argument was like, do I need them to be better or if they're all getting shoved into Cedar anyway, that's named well, like who cares? And I thought that like when I read that tweet, I'm a big factory guy. So when I read that, I was like, there was going to be massive backlash against this.
You're like, I'm stabbed in the heart.
Yeah. And I just thought like everyone's going to like jump on this guy and they're going to be upset about it. And actually it ended up being way more like 50-50 than I thought it would be.
Okay. Interesting.
A lot of people were like, yeah, of course. I just throw everything in a Cedar and call that Cedar for my test. And then, a lot of people were like, no, of course you need better factories and stuff like this. So it was like a whole big mess. And I really thought that it was like the death of better factories even being a potential thing in Laravel. And luckily, again, to go a little bit towards Laravel 8 is shipping with improved factories that are similar to the concept I wrote about in my blog that kind of triggered this.
Why I really should have recorded this one after Laravel 8. I'm so sorry. I just didn't even know this was all coming. This is awesome.
Yeah, and a lot of it actually, Taylor's actually been talking a lot about this stuff, so people probably do know about it, even if Laravel 8's not out by the time that this is, well, obviously not when it records, but when it goes out. But yeah, so it ended up being that I think he kind of came around, and I had a chance to talk with him a little bit about it a couple weeks ago, and I kind of asked, like, hey, I remember seeing that tweet, and it seemed like you were very anti the idea, and now you're coming back around to it. And he was like, kind of what I just said was like, he realized that, well, factories and Cedars are not mutually exclusive. Like, if factories are better, it makes Cedars better. Yeah. And so there's really no excuse not to improve factories. And so that was kind of, but it was people were getting pretty amped up about it for a while.
A little feisty. I like it.
Yeah, it was a little spicy.
I mean, and I like the feist and the spice about how to do things well and how to, like improve things versus like judging people for like not programming the way you program or whatever other stupid spice can happen sometimes. Cool.
Yeah.
All right. As always, I just looked at the time and realized we've been talking forever and I could keep talking forever. So, okay. Getting towards the end, is there anything else about migrations, factories, and Cedars you'd like to talk about? After this, I do want to really quickly go over your idea of class-based factories. So other than that, is there anything else you'd really like to talk about on this topic?
I don't think so. Not that directly is unrelated to what you're referring to. So I think I think we can get into that.
Okay. So essentially, I'm going to rely on people listening to the probably 30-minute long 20% time podcast with you and reading your article, which I'll link in the show notes, which is titled tidying up your test with class.
Tests. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So check that out and I'll link in the show notes too. But can you give us like the short version of your idea there?
Yeah. So basically, if you've ever used Laravel factories, they're really great, but they feel, and I think in the other podcast I said they feel like a hammer, and when you really maybe want to drill, and meaning that they're really great, but they're very, very simple. And when you get to the point where you're making when you're using factories a lot and you're dealing with data that is like deeply relational, and every time you need to create a user, you also need to create blog posts for that user, and you also need to create comments for the blog posts. Basically, when you're using factories like that with like very related data, you can end up having like a setup that's like 50 lines long or something crazy, right? Yeah. It's like, it's really wild. So basically, and the only reason that happens is because factories are kind of by their original design, just a little dumb, like in not a bad way, but they're just very simple. They're just like, they get data into the database. They're basically the most complex thing they really do is like states. And that's kind of it. Which to me was very like antithetical to the Laravel like way of doing things, which is that everything is so polished and so easy and so fluent. And if you're writing a query with Eloquent, you can probably guess without even knowing what exists that like you can write a query with just guessing method names. And to me, that is like the experience of being a Laravel developer. And factories were like the one place where to me, and I can put up with like a lot of stuff. I don't even, sometimes optimizations get released for Laravel and I go, I didn't even think about that. Like that didn't even bother me. But factories really bothered me for a long time. Yeah. And so, I was talking with a couple other people from Titan at, one of our on-sites, and we got into this big, long discussion about, factories and how we can improve them. And basically, kind of the end of that, I kind of just realized like, well, why not just create a simple class, like a basic PHP class, nothing, out of just normal PHP class that returned the factory. So for instance, if you would normally do like factory user create and then pass in an array of data for that user with like a name and an email or whatever it may be, what if instead of that, you had a user factory class with a create method and you pass the array to that method and then that method passed it directly to the factory? And if you're listening to this, you might think like, well, who cares? Like that's just a direct, like you're just abstracting away the factory create method. But in reality, what's actually happening there is that you're unlocking the power of object-oriented programming. Once you're inside of a class, you have the ability to make fluent methods, and you can chainable methods or write methods that are whatever you want. And so the simplest way that I can kind of outline this idea and the topic of the blog post is that what I call class-based model factories are really just simple classes that return factories, and then you can add whatever methods you want to them. So in our other example of like, if you need a user with blog posts and comments for those blog posts, instead of saying, user factory create and then, blog create, and then you pass in the user ID to the blog, and then you create the comments, and then you pass the comments to the blog, and then all of a sudden you're like 10 lines deep. Instead of that, what you do is you just say, user factory with blog posts, 3, with comments 10, and create, and all of a sudden your like 10-line monstrosity has become a 1-line readable,
super expressive
piece of code that reads like a book, right? And like that to me was much more in line with what the rest of Laravel felt like.
Yeah. And when I first heard about the idea of class-based factories, model factories, I assumed it was going to be more like repositories, which were very popular in Laravel and thankfully aren't anymore, where people would just write these, like you'd have one method that would be something like : with 3 users and 5 whatevers. And then there'd be a message right after it that would be like with 5 user whatever. So this idea of like being a fluent chain where you can add and modify, it feels so much more Laravel-y and it feels so expressive. I love the idea that I can write those sentences, but I can write them by chaining, by fluent chaining, not write them by like massive method names. Right. And if I don't need comments, I just leave off the comment, method or whatever, and then I'm good to go. I love how it reads, and I love how it simplifies things too. So,
yeah, they're pretty. Yeah, to me, they've been very powerful. They've kind of changed the game for factories for me. So I've enjoyed working with them.
Total side note, but yesterday I wrote a test that had, I think, like 12 lines of mocking setup code, and now I'm like totally disconnected from this, thinking like, can I build class-based mocking? Yeah, like could I do that? I'm now actually super curious. I think I might have to look at it after this. Yeah, like you totally could. Yeah. Okay, cool. So what are some good ways for people to learn about this? So I'm going to link to your interview in 20% time. I'm going to link to your Laracast, the Laracast talking about your way of doing it. And I'm going to link to your blog post. So those are all about the specific context of class-based model factories. But what about in general? How do you learn about migrations factories and Cedars?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that luckily the Laravel documentation itself is unlike most other frameworks or tools in general, that it has phenomenal documentation. So I'd say if you want to learn about them, definitely read, obviously, the Laravel documentation. Of course, there's Laracast, which has a video for Laravel up and running for almost any, just from scratch on Laravel 6 and 7 and whatever it may be. There's, of course, this great book that a phenomenal man wrote named Laravel Up and Running, which just a really great guy. And that has everything you would ever dream of needing. So just forget everything else I said and just read that book. And I'd say those are your three core ones there. And anything else is just like read some other open source projects. Luckily, I think the beautiful thing about this, everything that we talked about today, even my concept of class-based model factories, which maybe sounds scary because it's like 4 words or whatever, but they're all simple. They're all simple concepts. And there's always going to be a learning curve for anything that you're learning if you're new to it, but they are going to be things that you're doing every day in any project, and it won't take you long to get a grasp on them. So books, Laravel Up and Running, Laracast, documentation, you're set to go.
I love it. All right. So the last thing I do on each of these before plugs and how people can follow you is the fun moment, which, as you're aware, you have no idea what it is when it's coming. So at Titan, we often will respond to things that you say with a little emoji that is the TV Guide logo. So I'm not going to say too much more from there, but I do want to ask you, as someone who knows a lot about TV, what do you think the best TV show of all time is?
Yeah, my favorite TV show of all, this is easy for me.
Is it? I didn't know that.
Yeah. Avatar: The Last Airbender is my favorite TV show of all time.
Okay.
And I think you're getting into it. You're watching it right now, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, my son and I are almost through the first season, and it's freaking fantastic. I love it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And am I allowed to talk about your
dog is named? My dog is named Appa, which is after the character in the show. And it's kind of you might look at it and look at clips of it. You might think it's a kid show, and it was designed kind of for a younger age. And I was like,
it's accessible for kids.
Oh yeah, it's great for them, and it's also has really deep storylines for adults. And I love it, and I still love it. I just rewatched it, so it's great.
Yeah, literally every single time his sister is asleep because it's a little too scary for her. He's like, he'll come, like if like, let's say all three of us, like fell asleep for a nap at the same time or something like that. If he wakes up early, he'll come poke me and wake me up and like, let's go watch Avatar. And I'm like, okay, because I love it too. So yeah,
I do the same thing with my wife. I just like,
come on, let's go watch Avatar. She's like, just watch it by yourself. I love it. Yeah, that is fantastic. I thought as someone who has a lot of opinions and thoughts about TV that you would be like, oh, this is so hard. There's so many good shows. Wow, that was such a fantastically quick response. All right, cool. Yeah. Avatar and it's on Netflix for anybody who's curious. So
it's on Netflix, and they're even making a live action version. So yeah.
So a live action TV version though, right?
TV version. Yeah, they already made a terrible movie.
They made a movie that everyone says don't even watch. So
don't watch it.
Yeah, I saw the thing about a live action TV version. I hope it's really good. That's going to be exciting. Okay, so last thing, how can people follow you? Where are you on Twitter? What other mediums? What's your side project? All that kind of stuff.
Oh gosh, I have about 400 followers on Twitter, and I can't handle one more. So don't follow me anywhere. I've maxed out. It's too much.
There you go.
Too much responsibility for me. Yeah, I mean, follow Titan Co. On Twitter. That's where you'll find anything that is actually relevant or interesting that I do anyway. Will most likely be retweeted. Follow the Titan blog. That's where I'll write anything that's actually worth reading. So those are the core things. If you are by an odd chance a fan of the TV show Big Brother, which I know most people here have probably never ever heard of.
I don't think so. I think most people have heard of it, right?
If you've heard of it, or maybe you heard about it 20 years ago and you've forgotten about it, but I watch it, and I have a side project called fantasybp.com where it's like fantasy football for Big Brother. And it's like, I love it. It's the one thing that I will plug. So if you're a fan of the show, check out that.
It's free, right?
Yeah, it's free. Yeah, it just costs me money. It's not free to me.
Yeah, right. I kind of wish that I watched Big Brother, because the idea of playing fantasy, because it's the idea of like with the that Survivor thing, right, where people get voted off or something like that. I feel like
Survivor, but in a house. Yeah.
I feel like you should. No, I don't think you should. I would love to do that for like every show I ever watched that was like that, where people get voted off. I feel like there should be, like, you should make a like a subdomain for each one, like Big Brother dot whatever, fantasy reality TV shows.com or something like that. Of course, you have enough work on your plate right now. But I wish I watched Big Brother because that sounds like so much fun, especially if like you and your friends watch it like across the country every week or something like that. That's so cool.
Yeah.
All right. John Bonaccorsi, you are wonderful. I so much appreciate your time. Thank you so much for teaching us and sharing with us and just being a good guy.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm a long-time listener, first-time caller here, so it's been great. Yeah.
I love it. All right, thank you all, and we'll see you all next time.
See ya.